Labor Talks was John DeRozier, recorded at Chippewa Valley Community Television in Eau Claire, Wisconsin.
Hello and welcome to Labor Talks. Today's special guest is Myron Buchholz. Myron teaches history at Eau Claire Memorial High School. He's been teaching there for 18 years, I believe that's correct?
Correct.
And Myron, welcome to Labor Talks. Glad to have you here.
Pleasure to be here.
I understand you have a certain specialty, is that correct?
At Memorial, I've been mainly teaching world studies and AP US history. And so when you teach it, you get good at it over the course of time.
Okay. And what is AP? Isn't that...
Advanced placement.
Okay.
And so at the end of the course, if you are successful in passing the test, you can earn college credit at many universities across the country, including here in Eau Claire.
Excellent. Very good. Now, our first question is this. And Myron does know a thing or two about labor history. That means he knows a thing or two more than I do about labor history. So Myron, please explain the importance of labor history and why it should be taught in our public schools.
Well, I think we'll back it up just a little bit and just say history in general. When I try to explain why history is important to my students, one of the things I say is it teaches you to not touch the hot stove twice. And that old saying about, not knowing your history, you're condemned to repeat it. At the very base level, for a child, that's it. Don't touch the stove. We've been burned over and over and over again. And the beginning, the purpose of history is at that very core, is to know your past and don't make the same mistakes twice. And unfortunately, as we watch things unfold, the same mistakes are being made over and over and over again, and we should stop that. But also, there is a certain amount of assault on the teaching of history in public schools, and I can't help but believe that one of the reasons for that is to defeat the idea of not knowing your past. You can't argue if you don't know your history. And I know with labor history in general, there isn't a lot being taught, and children grow up, and they have been growing up for a number of years, especially since the 1980s. If they hear about labor, they hear a negative story about labor. So it's, to me, understandable why when you have the uprising that we had in 2011, that you had a significant number of people think that you're wrong, you're greedy, all of the terms that are used to attack labor over the course of years were there. And outside agitators and bosses and the thuggery and all that stuff, when in fact it was just a bunch of people like you and me. And they painted us in a fashion that if you don't know your history, well, you hear them say it and you believe it.
Now, this period we're going through, can we compare it to the same period in the early 1900s and when people like Jay Gould were really condemning the working class, calling us thugs, that type of thing? Didn't Jay Gould say a few things that got your attention, shall we say?
Well, the most famous one is, I can hire half of the working class to kill the other half. And he was right. And that comes back to that, how you appeal to the majority of people, actually, because when you look at peak union membership in this country, it never exceeded 30%. Well, that means 70% of the workforce is not unionized. Well, if you can appeal to a significant portion of that, you can make the labor side of it look really bad. As we stand here now, we're at somewhere nationwide around 11%. The majority of those are people like me, who were late to the game and have held on to our unions longer and than the blue collar, the original, the beginning of the National Labor Union and the Knights of Labor did. And so we have a real interesting thing going on here where we are, and I say me, educators and white collar workers and government workers are looked at by other people in the workforce as having extra benefits and extra things, and the question is, do we deserve it? And as I said earlier, when you have 70% of the workforce at the peak of labor 80, 90% of the workforce not unionized now. When they hear the assault that is put on people who actually are members of the union, you can expect a significant percentage of those people to think, yeah, unions, what good are they? They're hurting me, and they buy into that. Earlier you asked why should it be taught, and I started out by saying, the basis of history. Why? The big question is just history in general, but for high school students, I always like to point out that unions gave us the weekend, the 40-hour work week. Well, the 40-hour work week is slipping away on us. And so that you have a significant amount of our workforce that's under 40 hours, meaning they're part-time, meaning they have to have 2 jobs. Well, some of the good old union songs from the early 1900s, one of the great lyrics is, how can I get a job when you're holding down 2? Either you're working more than 40 hours and keeping me from working, or you have 2 jobs, which keeps me from maybe having a part-time job. And so the weekend is a big deal. An interesting thing that I've thought about a lot in the last few years is, when I started teaching in 1981, the standard argument was always, oh, teachers have it so easy, they have that 9-month work year. And of course teachers would counter by saying, well, if you add up all the extra hours besides just that contract day, it works out to be pretty equal to your typical white-collar 9-to-5 worker. Well, you can make that argument, and statistically you could support it. I don't know that you can do that today. And with all of the electronic devices and with your white-collar workforce taking their work home with them, and a basic statistical examination says that people are working more and more and more for roughly the same pay, what do I have? I have significant vacation. And we are one of the few professions in the country that has that, and you have to travel outside the country to other places to get time off.
Now, when you were a young teacher, I believe you taught in North Dakota.
I sure did.
Correct?
Mm-hmm.
And at that time, it was difficult to convince you to become active or even join a union. Is that accurate?
Initially, I was very supportive. But then when you find yourself working in, at one point, the lowest average pay in the nation, a young teacher...
You were supportive of what?
Of the union. Initially, I was supportive. My father was a postmaster. He had a union. The letter carriers had a union. They had good jobs. They had time off, wages, hours, and conditions, the big 3. And I saw that growing up. That was there wasn't anything else for me in the rural state of North Dakota to really appreciate the union for, but my dad's job and the letter carrier in every small town, it's a great job. I got into teaching because I really liked it. The first few years, well, teachers don't get paid very well.
That's
okay?
True.
And we are muddling along and doing okay. I switched schools, and I start to ask myself the question, like so many young teachers do, am I getting a bang for my buck? What am I getting for my union dues? And when you show up as the worst paid state in the nation, below even Alabama and Mississippi one year, that challenges your thoughts on what am I getting? What is the benefit? And sometimes that's very, very hard to point out. And one of your questions I know that you gave me ahead of time was, what's the purpose? Where are we now? And I am born at the right time to benefit from the previous 80 to 90 years of union agitation. And so do I feel a connection to that? And for many young workers today, as well as young workers in the 1980s, we've just lost that connection to what those workers went through. And they went through some terrible, terrible times. To give us the 40-hour work week, wages, hours, and conditions, the middle class, which I don't even think is a term that we should use anymore. I think it should just be the poor and the working class, because we're all in it together in reality.
If you're talking to a young teacher now, and you're trying to persuade that young teacher, male or female, to become active in his or her union, what would you say?
Number one, it's the only thing you have. You have no other choice.
Why?
because, well, the argument that is out there on the internet, and it is so pervasive for young workers, is you are better off going to negotiate with your boss one-on-one. The last school board meeting, one of the last school board meetings I attended, I listened to a woman, I'm sure she had all the right things in mind, testified before our school board that she knew of a story of a young teacher in San Francisco who got fired because of the union. And she was a good fired up teacher, and boy, she would have been great. And then she went on to talk about tenure, which of course we don't have. If you don't, unions support the fellow worker. If you don't have a union, the argument is you are better off going in to negotiate one-on-one with your boss. Well, when has that really ever been available for most of the workforce? And I'll tell you this, John, I got an example I use on my students that works really, really well. I ask them this.
Educate me.
Okay, I'll say to my class of
resist that.
a class of 30, and I'll say, I want all of you have been called to the principal's office for something other than being patted on the back and being told you're doing a good job. All of you have been invited to the principal's office. Raise your hand. Well, of course, any class of 30, you might get 10 to 15 hands go up. And then I'll ask them this: how would you, what would you have liked to have had happen? You one-on-one with the principal? Or you going in to meet with the principal with 30 of your closest friends and relatives? Oh, gee, they get that. They pretty quickly arrive at the conclusion that I would rather be meeting with my principal with 30 of my friends and relatives sitting behind me, because no, I'm not going to get yelled at. No, I'm pretty sure I'm going to get treated really, really fairly. Well, at the very base, that is what you have with a union. You've got somebody watching your back. And that's a very, very powerful thing. And young people understand that, because having that meeting with 30 of your closest friends and relatives, maybe you did something wrong, I tell them to them. And 30 of your closest friends and relatives, if you really did something wrong, deserve to be fired, as we like to, hear it said all the time, or we hear it said all the time. Well, your closest friends and relatives sometimes will be very honest with you and tell you that, you know what, you screwed up and you deserve what you get. But if you're being treated unfairly, now you have the reason for a union.
So this does bring back some memories, and I'm just going to jog yours a little bit by saying that neither you nor I were ever called to the principal's office for misbehaving.
I was.
I was never,
Oh, okay.
ever. No. And that's a line of bull. I guarantee you that right now. I'm
Saw
just
right
having
through
some
that.
fun. But we've both been there,
Mhm.
and we both know the logic to your argument to your students.
Mhm.
Okay, so thank you for that. I couldn't resist. I simply couldn't resist. Now, is labor history being taught in our public schools?
Well, I can only speak really for my experience here at Memorial, and watching, across the country and listening to news reports about history and how history is taught. I know it's less and less, and I know that when you were in high school and when I was in high school, it was very common across the board that U.S. history was a full year course. Here, U.S. history has been relegated to a semester at 9th grade level. Our curriculum here starts with the 1930s and tries to get to present. Well, in a semester, there's a lot to pack in the 1930s to try to get to current events. And so everything gets cut a little bit. And in AP US history, we do the whole gamut from colonial all the way up to, we try to get to current. And again, because it is so much in such a short period of time, things get a short shrift. And it's unfortunate, because the labor history stories are really interesting stories to students, like any good history story, of course, but it does, I think, take a back seat.
Perhaps labor history could be taught as an elective.
Well,
it's not up to just you and me, but to the Board of Regents and...
Exactly, and what we're seeing across the country is social studies being cut back, curriculum being cut back. And so the difference between me arriving in Eau Claire in 1997, I probably could have promoted a course like that and would have had a good chance of having it approved. Now we're cutting back on our electives. And you might have heard, Texas controls the school books because it's a single statewide purchase, and so history books are written to be sold in Texas. Well, gee, that's an interesting history all by itself.
And could somebody be making some extra money off of that?
The book publishers and the testing companies are raking it in. And that's the shift, that we've seen. We're test, and yeah, it's an interesting shift. And there's only a couple of textbook publishers left because of the whole Texas thing. So you don't have a lot of choice when you go out to look for history books.
So let's take it or leave it.
Very much so. And the history books are easy to criticize. They always have been, and probably always will be.
And these textbooks, how accurate are they? Are they being objective and factual, or are they promoting a certain point of view?
Well, generally, there's a little bit of truth in everything. And textbooks are very good at putting a little bit of truth in everything in the textbook. And so, you have to pick and choose. It really comes down to how much time do you devote to it, and then what outside sources do you bring in. Because there isn't anything in the textbook by itself that really tells a whole picture.
I have a twofold question here. First of all, it seems to me that we are experiencing a new low for labor. Also, I noticed here that you have some graphs that you might want to refer to, and perhaps leave it with our highly qualified CBC TV staff, including Brad Hoffman, who is standing right behind the camera and is making me look good.
Well, I saw that
Hold
question.
that against him, folks.
I saw that question about new low, and well, I would have to disagree. I did a little rudimentary addition process of looking at strikes from the 1890s until the 1930s, roughly 60 plus years. And one of the things that is a common drumbeat anti-union is how violent labor has been. And you hear that all the time. I remember once during the 2011 Uprising, I woke up to turn on a local TV channel to hear that there was violence at the Capitol. And I called that TV channel and I said, what happened? And they didn't know. They just repeated what they had been told. Well, nothing had happened. And that went out over the airwaves. People hear it and they believe it. I added it up, and in about 60 years, roughly 33 strikes where there was violence up to 1938, and 645 union workers being shot to death, 2,288 being wounded. You would expect that if labor is bringing the violence, then the other side, the management side, would be a higher number, correct? Mm-hmm. Yes. True. Well, no. If what I added up, and give or take, it's 61 deaths on the management / Pinkerton / government side compared to 645 deaths. And unfortunately, some of those 61 deaths were white labor in the early days killing black labor in the racist society that we had, and this is another huge problem with the labor issue. It's like herding cats, and we've been more easily kept apart than we have been brought together, and that shows up in this. So it's not just all. Some of that 61 deaths on the other side, unfortunately, was labor too.
So you don't think that right now, even though labor is on the receiving end of, shall we say, we're getting the short end of the stick, we are not at a new low point for labor, that there have been other times that where we weren't doing so well?
Well, being hung under a railroad bridge for union organizing would be lower than what we're at. And of course, it is one of the big issues. When do we hit bottom? When you look at the miners and what I call the lowest of the lows, and that sounds like a put down, but that's how they were viewed by the owners. They're disposable workers. Go in the mine, die, doesn't matter to me, just mine the coal. When the lowest of the lows were able to organize, they were looking at death on a regular basis at their job. And they had everything to gain. Your typical worker today is hanging on. And we have our, our fancy electronic devices, and many people are, have their cable TV, and they're hanging on. I don't think we're quite there yet, but watching the arc of history, it doesn't appear that it's going in the right direction for labor, and I fear that, because...
So it can get worse.
Yeah, it can get a lot worse.
Well, I had to ask.
Yes, and that's a scary thought. I would like our politicians to see that coming. I would like our politicians to recognize the gap that is happening when you have labor making less and less and less, and the wealthy making more and more and more, and making some adjustments for that and easing some of the strain. But I don't see a lot of that coming out of our recent Congresses.
Now, Myron does know labor history. He really does. So I'm going to ask him about Joe Hill. I think that name rings a bell with you.
Sure does.
The Wobblies and Joe
Yes.
Hill.
One big union.
Why don't you expound on that a little bit? And what happened with Joe Hill?
Well, Joe Hill was framed and tied to a chair and shot to death. He's only one of the most famous ones of the labor agitators. One of the old Union songs is the Union Burying Ground. And that's reflected in these numbers when you start talking about 645. And I'm not going to argue that that's an exact number, and I'm certainly not going to argue that it's low, because these are the documented ones. There was plenty of that significant abuse. The Pinkertons and the various National Guards and the police force. I mean, we had our own strike here in Wisconsin at the Bayview Massacre. The governor called out the National Guard, and simply, this was right after the Haymarket affair, and they just opened fire. That's a low, and we need to remember that.
Joe Hill was a labor organizer. And yes, like Myron said, he was tied to a chair and shot, executed. What were his last words? Now I'm testing your memory.
Well,
Come on.
I have
Come
nothing
on.
to divide. This is my last will and testament. Joe Hill, I can't remember.
Don't mourn for me.
That's right. Organize. Oh, how can I not remember that? Just organize.
I will remind
It's
you.
outstanding. Oh, no, I know that one. Yes, that's a good one.
Who's about to lose everything, and those were his last words.
Organize,
That is
yeah.
remarkable. How could you forget something like that, Mr. Buchholz?
Oh, you stumped me. It happens. I look at my students and say, I know everything. And then it takes them a while, and they go, oh, I don't think so.
Okay, well, now, when was labor most effective and why?
That is such a good question, and so impossible to argue, because labor was most effective for my generation, and I was not involved in it. And that's what I alluded to earlier, that I am the beneficiary of that. You are the beneficiary of all this labor antagonism, and many times those strikes, when they happened, didn't work to the advantage of the workers. But in the big picture, all of them taken together, we got societal change. And so one has to argue, I think I have to argue, that the generation post-World War II, the baby boom generation, is the best example of what happens, because that is the time period roughly then to the 1980s when the gap between the haves and have-nots is the smallest. Minimum wage adjusted for inflation is like $15 an hour then. And you had vacation, you had benefits, and of course people who were not in a union shop benefited from those 30% of the workers who were, because you have to pay competitive wages. And so, even if you're not in a union shop, you benefit from having that union support and the constant agitation for better wages, hours, and conditions. And that's a good thing for the working person.
Yeah, one of the things I pointed out before we were on the air was that in 1955, the rubber workers went on strike, and it was quite a strike, but out of it, they got retirement benefits, health benefits, that type of thing. And it really, really paid off for them in the long run, so I think
Very
that's-
much so. And teachers and white-collar workers were the last to really unionize. The government workers didn't get much until the 1930s, and then they didn't really have the right to collectively bargain until the 1970s. And that was a long, long struggle, and so we're at the end of the story. and now I'm expecting cyclically it'll come around again. I'm going to stay tuned. I should have a front row seat.
Now, is there anything else you'd like to add, or are there any questions you think I should have asked?
Well, one of my favorite things that I jotted down here was, you know, it's easy to find the quotes that matter. And when you start comparing notes, I have got a couple of them. You mentioned Jay Gould earlier. You know, I can hire half the working class to kill the other half. That's in the 1800s. You get to the 1980s, after the Patco strike, you have the owner of the Dallas Cowboys, Tex Schramm, saying players are cattle, and I can always get more cattle. Well, that's the 1980s. You know, how much changed really from the 1880s to the 1980s, and then of course today the most famous one that is circulating amongst our circles is, you know, the protesters and making some connection to ISIS. Pretty much puts me in my place. I know exactly where I stand when I look at those three quotes on labor history, and I don't have much clout when the leaders are talking about me and my kind, the working class, like that, unless you have a union.
Okay. Well, that's our program for today. My thanks to our viewing audience and to Myron. Myron, thank you very much.
This was fun.
Point blank, if it wasn't for people like Myron, and specifically Myron today, we would not have a program, and I think today was an exceptional program. Obviously, if we didn't have an audience, we'd have no program at all. So, my thanks to our viewing audience. And please contact your respective legislators and let them know of your support for community television. It's one way you can not only support community television, obviously, but labor as well. And let's see, Labor Talks can be seen on channel 993 every Wednesday at 7:30 p.m., every Saturday at 12:30 p.m., and we're also on YouTube, and thank you very much.
Chippewa Valley Community Television is made possible by continuing community support. If you would like to volunteer or make a donation, you can contact us by calling 715-839-5067 or on the web at www.cvctv.org.